This is a test. This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test.
James McMahon Music Podcast. James McMahon Music Podcast. James McMahon Music Podcast. James McMahon Music Podcast. He speaks to the geeks and the musical freaks, but sometimes popular but mostly a freak because he's James McMahon Music Podcast. James McMahon Music Podcast.
This concludes this test of the emergency broadcast system.
I just took a photo of the contents page because I was like, my microphone's totally going to pick up me flicking through. So if I occasionally look at my phone, it's because I'm looking at the contents sheet. So
don't worry, I might have to look at it in the book if we get too deep.
Yeah, I'm not meaning to be rude. I guess a good place to start is, why did you want to write the book? I've got theories about why you wanted to write the book, but I'd be interested to know why you wanted to.
Yeah, so I mean, really, the inspiration was Jason Everman, because he sort of has this outsized. He looms large for me, even though he really, as a musician, he's a tiny piece of history. But I was so obsessed with Nirvana. I read that you'd said that you'd heard them on a crappy Walkman in a youth club, and that was you've been trying to recreate it ever since. And for me, I'd been trying to describe the sound of Nirvana before I heard them, because I knew there must be something out there that was hard and thrashy, but wasn't macho and was, had more of a punk thing than a metal thing, I guess. And so it was, as I say in the book, it was a Sex Pistols moment for me, and that just changed everything. And as a result, anything related to that band just sort of looms larger. And I had the posters that had Jason on them, and years later, when I was probably having a bit of a sort of early 30s malaise, I came across this article in the New York Times on Everman, and I was like, I recognize that face, and they said that he'd become this highly decorated Green Beret. And I've always had this parallel fascination, which is a slightly embarrassing fascination with special forces soldiers, which is obviously can be a sort of as I say in the book, something that can be a sign of sort of unwholesome far right types, but hopefully it isn't with me. But I always thought that these people, they're like endurance athletes that put themselves in these incredible situations, and there's something preternaturally tough about them, and I'm not like that, so that fascinates me. And to see that he'd gone from my favorite band to doing this, obviously it was just sort of very, very interesting to me. And I thought that's just such a great story. I knew I wanted to write a non-fiction thing next, and then so I kind of thought, well, maybe I should write a book about him. And then, as so often in the writing life, someone helps you out, and my old fiction editor said, well, you should write a whole book about people like that. And that was the inspiration, really. And then very quickly after that, Steven Adler of Guns N' Roses, I knew very quickly that I'd have to write about him, because it was such being told that he was kicked out as a 10-year-old was, again, had such a huge effect. I just couldn't believe that someone in this band I loved so much was disappeared like that. And it just flowed from there, really. Obviously there are so many of these great stories, and very quickly they seemed to show a different way into bands and to the dynamics of them. And it just poured out after that. It was definitely the most fun I've ever had writing anything.
I'm gonna put my psychologist hat on here, which I am prone to do on this podcast a lot. Was there something about the idea of rejects that you related to yourself?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I sort of more or less make that explicit in the book, don't I? But yeah, I've gone.
You do, but I felt like you do, but you don't. I felt like you.
No, I don't go into the. Yeah, it's. I mean, I think after it's 25 years this year of working in the music business, and I've certainly been knocked around. There was a long period where I sort of had what felt like only ascent and things going well, and I've definitely had my tribulations in more recent years. I think nearly everybody does, whatever they do. But and I'm prone to some of these. I haven't always been the most moderate character, and so there was a lot that kind of I've always loved these people partly because I see myself in them, and I've got a lot of. I suppose that's where the sympathy comes from. So yeah, I think that was part of it. I mean, it wasn't really a conscious part of it until I started, I guess, writing what became the introduction to the book. But yeah, I think that's certainly there. I sort of feel as though I've gone through a bit of that myself in various ways, and so yeah, I felt a lot of sympathy for most of these people.
Feel like you should lie on the couch. I think sometimes when we write things, we don't really know why we're writing them until we're in the guts of it, But I felt like I remember when I was a kid, I used to read these books. This feels very archaic, but like books that monthly music magazines would have as promo gifts, like cover mounts, which, like I say, feels crazy to think that was a thing. But your book kind of felt a little bit like that to me in places. Like there was all these just amazing stories, but it's just that I feel like you'd found a different way to come at them. And I guess I was really, I really rally against how kind of prudish and moralistic music has become in recent times, mainly because I think it's a terrible way for people to be able to produce art if you're constantly frightened of how it's going to be perceived. And if there is no wiggle room and leeway for certain behaviors or certain views, then we're just going to end up with a monoculture, and that's a terrible thing. I'm going to get off my podium now. It was that conscious that you were trying to tell these great stories, but you were also trying to not wag your finger at people involved in them?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, I knew that there wasn't going to be any censoriousness in the book, and I think I always hate it when a writer is judging unless you're, I guess, if you're a great New Yorker writer that's writing about a sort of an ethical thing, maybe there needs to be more of that. But I wanted to just let the stories speak for themselves and let put all the behavior on display, but I think the reader just always needs to be trusted to draw their own conclusions, and writers feel now that they have to point in that direction to show they're on the right side or something. But I wasn't worried about that at all. Readers are, by definition, smart people that can draw their own conclusions. So yeah, I never wanted to judge any of these people at all. And yeah, I completely agree. I think obviously change had to take place everywhere, but at the same time, I loved a lot of the really difficult people that I worked with and for, and that weren't always great to me. And those were formative experiences, and I learned loads from those people. Sometimes I learned the wrong thing from those people, but to have all of that vanish, I think, does make music and art less interesting. I think I can't put it better than you just did. That when things are gripped by fear, that's not really a good environment for interesting stuff to be made. I mean, obviously, it's very tricky to talk about all of this because the downsides of this stuff turn into true horror, don't they? And someone's actually behaving in an abusive way, that outweighs any. It's very difficult to say, well, what about the art? But most of these people in the book, there's a couple of exceptions where they did things which are, I hesitate to use the word unforgivable with anyone really, but getting towards that. But most of it is just kind of a lot of people having tricky starts in life, being hurt, having problems, being susceptible to certain things, and the music industry being a very different place, and no one really understanding how to take care of each other. So yeah, no, it was very, very, very important not to be judgmental of any of them, really.
I mean, my favorite. I mean, I've told you this when we weren't recording, but my favorite chapters were the Wiley ones. And I did Manga Saint Hilaire on the podcast recently, and we had a bit of a chat about Wiley, and it's an interesting one for me because I've got loads of friends who are Jewish, and I feel like this is a terrible time for well, certainly I can only speak for what's on my doorstep, but for British Jews, and I feel like it's a kind of bigotry which is so complicated but yet so dismissed by so many supposed progressive people. So I almost feel kind of like slightly wary myself of saying I absolutely love Wiley's music, and I kind of I feel empathy for the guy while also completely rejecting everything that he said. You know, he must have felt like manga when what he said on that episode, which I urge anyone listening to the podcast to go listen to, because I thought it was a good conversation. But I almost felt like he could have gone a little bit further in his condemnation of what was said.
That was interesting, wasn't it? Yeah, I listened to the episode avidly, and I thought that too. But again, without really judging him on it, because you know, it's difficult, isn't it? He's very close to Wiley. But yeah, I mean, you know, so I'd preface this by just saying, you know, because obviously most of your esteemed listeners and viewers won't have read the book, but you know, I in no way wanted to launch any sort of defense of what he said, and you know, it's completely unacceptable. And I also wanted to make it very clear that I very much swing the other way in terms of, you know, I think that the anti-Semitism has clearly been growing in the UK and the US at a frightening rate, and I'm not someone that takes it less seriously than other forms of bigotry. In fact, the other way, you know, a lot of my American family all descend from a Holocaust survivor, and but yeah, I wanted to write a portrait of Wiley as I knew him and know him, and show all of the nuance and all of the good side, you know, the vast amounts of good. He's predominantly a very good man. I haven't seen anyone behave as well as him in music, actually, in terms of what he tried to do and how generous he was, both with young artists and with me. And the big thing I wanted to get across was that it's very difficult to do. You know, we live in this age of supposed kindness, and it's very difficult to judge someone like Wiley, you know, a British black man from a certain strata of class, really, by the same cozy middle class standards that we might judge someone like me. You know, if I said something completely unacceptable like that. And these men do live in a parallel world. They you know, I was struck by how Wiley just couldn't travel safely around London when I first started working with him. You know, you go to a different postcode and your life is in danger. He was threatened and menaced with weapons lots of times. He was been stabbed 14 times. He's been pinned down by a grown man and had his face slashed for not getting another kid on radio. And you know, he was raised in very difficult circumstances, doesn't have the sort of, he's very, very intelligent, and I don't mean to condescend him at all, but you know, he hasn't had the sort of education that someone like me has had, and a lot of the people that might judge him have had. And I think it's just really important this doesn't excuse anything, but it does potentially, it explains why someone isn't going to behave in a, you know, why someone might have an erratic side to them and might be prone to this sort of outburst and all of that. I just wanted to get all of that across, really. And you know, for someone that's as generous as Wiley, it just felt like the full picture of him needed to be out there. And you know, I'm sure he doesn't need me to do that, but I wanted to do it because it's partly my story. You know, I've worked with him for many years, and in a way, it's a sad story because it was kind of the best time of my career in terms of pure passion and. So yeah, I wanted to get all of that out there and just say some of that.
Yeah, I mean, regular listeners to the podcast will know my views on lots of these things, but I just think that people are more than an utterance or a view, or I feel like your piece, whilst not it never consciously comes across as like an attempt to rehabilitate him, but by showing him warts and all, I felt like the guy deserved another shot. And like I say, I do feel slightly uncomfortable saying that just because I know what a torrid time my Jewish friends are having. But I feel like the older I get, I mean, I've never read the Bible cover to cover, but I do. The older I get, there's just enough from Sunday school that I remember thinking that's quite a good bit of teaching. You know, that whole kind of never judge someone until you've like walked however many miles in their shoes. I think like there's something in there where, because ultimately there isn't a skip where you can just put all the bad people, quote unquote bad people, you know, like we have to live amongst each other. So there has to be, you know, teachable moments, so to speak. I think I loved that chapter. I was welling up a little bit there when I was thinking about it. The other chapter that really moved me and I really learned a lot from it, was the Andy Nicholson chapter, because I was at the Enemy when all that was going on, and we maybe, I'm not gonna throw myself under the bus, but there maybe was a slight bit of mirth that the band was shedding their bass player, who maybe didn't look like, he wasn't all chiseled cheekbones in the photo shoots. There was maybe a slight bit of Mickey taking, and to actually see the kind of human toll, or to learn more about what the kid had gone through, I thought was devastating, to be honest, and it made me feel quite bad for if I ever did quip. Did you find that chapter difficult to write? Because I found it difficult to read.
Yeah, in some ways it's the saddest one in the book, isn't it? And yeah, what you just said is very interesting. I think not that long ago we lived in a much more vituperative age, didn't we, where it was okay to take the piss, and people's physical characteristics were, if you think of some of the things, I think back to a line in one of the style magazines about the way certain women were dressing in the mid-noughties, that sort of the sort of dresses and flat shoes thing. And I remember reading something really nasty about the way women were dressing, or a picture of a certain woman, and that would be completely inconceivable now, I think, in a mainstream publication. But yeah, it's not so long ago that kind of open piss taking and was around. But yeah, I mean, he's incredibly eloquent, isn't he? Basically, and the way he describes what happened to him is the starkest and most succinct in the whole book, I think. Really, that vision of him sitting in a dark room watching them on Glastonbury for the first time, crying and feeling suicidal. I mean, it's hard to contemplate, and it makes total sense. And the fact that he was so obviously properly traumatized by it, he can't remember those years. It's just darkness, and and the memory of going into that room and realizing it was a plan, and there was a plan. They were going to sit him in a certain place, and that they would be in a certain place. And then the fact, that line, we went back from before we knew how many strings were on a guitar or whatever. You just, nowhere in the book is that thing about the shock of your best mates kicking you out more clear than in his story. So yeah, I think that's the one that really stands out to me, that really shows how it feels, isn't it? It's just kind of, he says it's soul destroying, and I think to bounce back from that must be extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The Jason Everman chapter, I felt kind of similar about a little bit. And I was so pleased when your interview with him turns up at the end. Spoilers for anyone reading the book. But I was so pleased because, I'd sat through, I'm a little bit of a Joe Rogan apologist, but I'd sat through an excruciatingly tedious interview that Joe Rogan had done with him, where he seemingly knew nothing about anything other than shooting at people in a desert. And I found that very frustrating. And even though he seems slightly reluctant to talk about that era of his life when he's achieved so much since, I thought he did really well to get some of the music stuff when he was talking about how he feels when he looks back at the idea of Kurt Cobain and Chris Cornell not being here. But he really is, whatever your opinions on what his profession is now, like, he has such a philosophical slant on things, and he is really embodies what I think the message of the book is, that there is no one way in all of this. There is no one way in life. You can have a second act, a third act, a fourth act. Well, you should be able to anyway, maybe not in the case of Wiley, which is, again, kind of what we're talking about. But I thought that was amazing. So props to you for that. Thank
you. Yeah, it's really, I'm so pleased that you said that about the Rogan interview, because it makes me, because I was a bit like, suddenly I tracked him down, and then suddenly he was doing obviously a astronomically huge platform. But yeah, he's just a very fulfilled character. I have to be slightly careful. I was accused in one of the reviews of lionizing him, so I've got to be careful not to appear to be too pro Everman. But
who wrote that?
Maybe it was in the New Statesman. I need to be careful about not getting this wrong now. But yeah, most of the reviews have been very positive, and I'm very, very grateful to be reviewed, having experienced getting 0 reviews on a novel. So I'm not complaining. He's a very fulfilled character, and he found his true calling, didn't he? He was never really meant to be tossing his hair around badly in Nirvana. And to go and do that, and then to get his philosophy degree, and I think he's got a master's degree now on top of that. And he seems like a very happy, fulfilled guy. And the way he talks, he says he's got demons, but he grapples with them, and it's a full-time job. And I thought what he said about Kurtz and Chris was really interesting, in the sense that, I think we probably all know, he did sort of say that he suspected there was a level of that they had in some ways fallen for the romantic myth of the tortured artist. And obviously he wasn't saying that was the only cause. They're both very troubled and had difficult backgrounds. But I thought what he said about Gen X generally, and the boomer parents and the divorces, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I think a lot of kids came out of those marriages, those bad marriages, in real trouble, and I think that explains a great deal. So I felt as though he shed loads of light on, because grunge is such a big era for me, and I've often thought about why it's such a dark form of music. It's so dark, isn't it? And but probably we could have all reached that conclusion. But probably I'd thought that might. It's there in Kurt Cobain's lyrics. It's hardly a huge insight, but I thought the way he talked about it was great. And it was a hugely inspired. I came away from that conversation very, very inspired, and it made me think. Tenacity is such a big thing in music or in life, and the amount of, if you just keep at something, eventually it comes right. It's like listening to you talk to Rick Witter. He just sounded so calm and steady and even. I just thought, wow, you've been through so much. And we did a record with him on Big Dada. We worked with this amazing producer called Part Two, and he lived in New York, and a few doors down Rick Witter lived. And he said, well, they were chatting, and he was like, well, I've got nothing going on, so if you want me to do a vocal on one of your tracks, I'd be well up for that. And so we put this single out with Part Two of Rick Witter. And I remember thinking, poor guy, he's just kind of, to go from all those covers to, all these of NME and Melody Maker, and then you sort of, but just to hear him talk to you,
I think famously they never got an NME cover, because I think that's
I think you touched on that.
Yeah. No, it's weird, like I reached a point, like when not wanting to sort of make this all about me, but in my book, in the book that I've written, there's a bit, because my book's all about my OCD and how difficult I found that in tandem with working in the music industry, because it isn't, even though it's a place populated by people who perhaps have complicated brains, it's not really a place set up for people with complicated brains. And there's this thing that I always remember. There's a guy that I used to work with at NME, and I remember going into the office once and him saying, "You're right," and me being like, "No, I'm struggling with this, and him taking my headphones off me and being like, "What are you listening to?" And I think I was listening to like Joy Division, or I don't know, Joy Division or Suicide or something like that was atonal and bleak. And I remember him being like, well, this is part of your problem. Like, part of the problem is what you're putting into your head. And it got me thinking a little bit about my way into music, and how much I love Joy Division, and how much I love Nirvana, and how obsessed I was with the Holy Bible by the Manic Street Preachers.
Oh, I love that record.
Yeah, and I kind of got a bit to the point where people like Rick Witter, for example, who have endured, or even like someone like, say, Jason Everman, who is there living, he is having his, in response to whoever said that about your book, my general view on people like Jason Everman and what he does for a living, or what he did for a living, is that these are necessary evils, if that makes sense.
Orwell quote, isn't there? The rough men standing ready.
He says that phrase, doesn't he? It's something like, well, war's bad, but there are worse things. I'm sure that was a line that came out of your interview.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
And I just sort of admire kind of mentally healthy people in music. Like, it's quite even though maybe they don't make the best music, although I would argue that Disco Down is as good a single as was released in the breadth of the 90s.
Yeah.
When you were going, I know we're darting about a bit, but when your decision to include Wiley, obviously you have this personal relationship with him. But also, there's quite a lot of variation in the contents. This isn't just people who've been booted out of bands. This is like in the case of Glenn Matlock, it's the kind of the urban legend. In the case of Wiley, this is something where like the audience rejected him, for want of a better term. How much thought did you put into that? Going, how can I explore the idea of rejection in all its forms?
So yeah, I decided to be quite loose with it at the outset. Really, I just thought that this book, I was having so much fun writing it. Even there's a lot of darkness in the book, and hopefully it's a serious book. But I had so much fun writing it, and there were so many great stories, and I didn't want to have to cut things just because I was being religious about the concept. And I kind of hoped that readers would come with me on that. Again, a couple of the reviews. It's interesting. A couple of people have really responded to the Wiley parts, and a couple have said that this is spurious. It doesn't really qualify. But I think that's always going to happen. I think as long as Constable and my agent sort of didn't feel strongly, that something shouldn't be in there. I don't think they did about anything. I just thought, I'm not going to be religious about this, and if there's some kind of form of rejection, even in a fairly loose sense, then it's going to qualify. And Glenn Matlock, is in some ways it's one of the most famous rejection stories, even though it's not true. Right? That had to go in there. And then there's people that are hounded out, and there's people that's not clear if they left or were fired. But yeah, I had a bit of a sense of, I knew I wasn't going to be able to put everybody in there, but I wanted to put as many people as I came across and felt that I had some way in on, or could write reasonably well about, hopefully. So yeah, I decided from the outset to be casual about it, hopefully not to the detriment of the book.
No. I think it's one of the most interesting things about it, to be honest. The Gary Young chapter, was he always on the slate, or did the documentary mean that you wanted to put him in there?
So yeah, I have to admit, Pavement are a really weird band for me, because I don't think there's any other record than Crooked Rain that I've listened to. I don't think there's a record I've listened to more than Crooked Rain. All through my life since it first came out, I've gone back to that record. And 2 Malcolmus albums, Real Emotional Trash and Pig Lib, I've obsessed over. But I didn't explore any further, really. I listened to Slanted and Enchanted, and I think I bought Wowie Zowie, but never really scratched the surface with it. So I have a very weird relationship with them, and I didn't actually know about Gary Young. I'd always quite liked Steve West drums on Crooked Rain, and it was only I ended up talking to Chris Cunningham, the video artist, through work, and he told me that he stopped liking Pavement really after Gary Young went. And I said, well, who's Gary Young? And so it's just this huge gap slightly shameful gap in my knowledge about a band that do loom very large for me. And yeah, I was instantly drawn, just a sort of definitely a character that I felt very drawn to, this kind of slightly older guy who had loads to offer, but had a completely different aesthetic, and his drinking was spiraling out of control. But all of these people gave the band something, is what I realized. That's one of the most beautiful things that happened when writing, that nearly all of them gave the band something they didn't have. And with him, that looseness, they did eventually, one of them says, eventually it rubbed off on us, and you see them start to move around on the stage and to thrash about a bit. And, he's just the footage of him and everything is, just a real character. They're doing handstands during Malcolmus's sort of solo numbers. And it's just,
I don't think Stephen Malcolmus is the most, despite how he presents himself, I don't think he's the most, he's the artist, isn't he, in that group, and obviously very talented and deserves his place in the Indie Rock Hall of Fame, but I've never seen any footage of those shows with Gary Young, but I just imagine there was part of him being like, what are you doing, you vagrant? Why are you doing this during my impeccably crafted indie rock songs? But did you know about the documentary?
No, so I started looking into him and then found out that this documentary had literally just been, I think it had been premiered a few months earlier at Sundance, I think. And so, yeah, it wasn't widely available. So I tracked the director down, and like everyone in the Pavement camp, everyone speaks. You probably met Magnus. I've never actually met him. I've worked.
No, neither have I. We've always crossed. We've always been kind of there or thereabouts. But now he's a rare name on the bucket list.
Right. Everyone in that world seems very friendly and approachable. And this guy Jed, I can't remember his surname now. Eisenberg. Got straight back to me and said, "Yeah, I'll send you a link to the film and love you to watch it." And it was the film is really great. A lot of the stuff they don't have footage for is acted out by these puppets, and the Gary Young puppet does look incredibly like him. These sort of weird, soulful, mesmerizing eyes that he had, and the timing was because I wrote that right at the end of the book. I think I'd handed it in and. Constable, my editor there, said, is there anyone else you think should go in there? And it just sort of fell into my lap, and so I sort of scrambled to write it. But it was again very moving writing that, because then of course he very sadly died just as I was setting out on that. But it felt good to record more about him. I mean, obviously that he's there in that film. They're not depending on me to record his life, but it felt like these are portraits, aren't they? And it felt great to be doing a portrait of him because there was always something very beautiful about him.
Yeah, with the Danny Whitten chapter, which is a real change in tone. I'm sort of just a bit nerding out as a writer here. Really, this is all stylistic stuff. But was it your experience as a fiction writer that made you go, I want to try to visualize what this guy's final days were? Yeah,
as soon as I read, so I got very, very obsessed with him, and in the way that that quote from Neil Young that every musician gets one musician who they play best with in their life, and his with Danny Whitten, and the obvious tragedy of it, and the way he foreshadows Kurt Cobain in some ways, treating chronic pain with heroin. And then Neil Young being brought back to that when Kurt used lines from the Neil Young song in his suicide note. So it was he was of real interest in me, and again I found him very sympathetic. And then as soon as I read about it, it just felt so cinematic. It's like you get back in the band, you go up to the ranch, you're supposed to be learning the songs, you've got every intention of getting off the drugs. And then it boils down, you're fired and you're sent back to LA with a few $100 because that's what they thought would be best for him. And then you die in horror coming on, trying that's your moment where you say, I've got to get off this drug, and you die as a result of attempting to do that. I thought that this is just begging to be written as a first person piece of fiction. But, again, I think the reviews some of them have been slightly kind about it, but I suspect it hasn't got. I always knew that people reading a non-fiction book might find it jarring, and I'm not sure people generally are loving that. But I feel reasonably proud of it, and I wanted to do it. And it just kind of, I have to give credit where it's due. That there's that great novella by John Niven, Music from Big Pink. I don't know if you've read that.
Oh, right, okay. No, I haven't, but obviously I'm aware of Killy Friends and some of his other
work. Well, he wrote this beautiful novella. It was his first thing, and I think it was for a series of music books. I can't remember the name of it. And it tells the story of the recording of Music from Big Pink from the perspective of a Canadian drug dealer that's selling drugs to the band, and Richard Manuel's kind of the main band character in it, I guess. Or it spends a lot of time on him. And so I loved the way that was written, and I kind of felt like, obviously John Niven is a very good writer, but I kind of felt like it could potentially be done with Danny Whitten, and so that was an inspiration. But yeah, I just felt he was such a vivid character for me, and I wanted to try and capture the full horror of that, and not being able to play and all that, Neil Young coaching him along and desperately trying to help him, and it just not working. It's just so sad.
No, I really loved that chapter. It made me think of maybe someone like David Peace, with the Damned United, where he steps into Brian Clough.
I love that.
Yeah, I thought it was good. And I also think by that point in the book, I'd realised that this wasn't just a series of profiles about people who'd been, I mean, it comes after that chapter, but, even the Kim Shattuck, who is a bit of a hero of mine, God rest her soul, but even just how brief that was, and it really was down to, how is it you described that in, there's a really good phrase.
Aesthetics are key or something like that. Yeah.
Because that stuff to me matters so much. I mean, I remember when I was in a band, I wasn't really. I stuck with people maybe too long, but when I was in a band, like there was a bit in my head going, "Your hair isn't right for this band," which is a bit rich me saying that now when I've got nothing up top. But when I was a younger man, these things matter. So I feel like you really did prove that this wasn't a formulaic. Here's a profile. So whoever said that, whoever critiqued that in the reviews, they can fuck off.
Oh, so I really appreciate you saying that, because I've been feeling slightly sensitive about that. But David P says you are far too kind, because that's very high praise indeed. But I'll take it.
Well, I also thought as well, the Nicola Berry chapters, that kind of, it said a lot about rejection. Almost like kind of finding yourself a million miles away from where you were at a particular point in your career, and whether that was his own fault or not, that's a thorny thing to get into, really. But just even by you going into almost like a gig review, and obviously you do include the photo you took, which I thought was quite a nice touch. But even just going into that kind of gig review and surrounding the sort of, is it Bournemouth? Almost sort of the sadness of him playing at this kind of rock club in a sort of grotty seaside town. No disrespect to people from Bournemouth listening, but you did a lot there without spelling it out, to be like, sometimes falling down the ladder is as brutal as you would imagine.
Yeah, I wanted to get that across, but at the same time, there's something beautiful about that too, isn't there? The tenacity and the fact that, when he walked through the crowd, you could still feel the outsized charisma of someone that's a serious, hardened musician who's been there, and you could feel that. And I don't think he didn't look like a broken man or anything. He looked like a lifelong rock and roll outlaw who's just going to keep doing it no matter what. And there is something beautiful in that. He obviously means it, and there's no. So yeah, I mean, obviously the surroundings for him have changed a lot. Although, as I say in those chapters, he still hangs out with Josh, I think, and he's still connected to that world. There seems to be lots of love for him in that world. But yeah, the book was always going to be freewheeling and stuff. I wanted to do all lots of different kinds of approach and keep it very entertaining. And I always knew that some bits of it would be very brief, because I sort of wanted someone to be able to pick up the book and just sort of read a half-page entry and maybe get drawn in that way. So yeah, but Oliveri, Queen's are a big band for me, and I really wanted to track him down. I wanted to have some more first-hand stuff in there, because I love reading these. I was thinking of things like David Foster Wallace going to the fun fair, or being on a 7NC mega ship and all this kind of stuff. And I love reading that sort of awkward first-hand journalism stuff.
Yeah. What did you make of Dave Mustaine? Because I think, again, a bit of a dream interview that I've never had the opportunity to do. Dave Mustaine's fascinating to me because he really did prove everyone wrong, and he is as important to the genre of music he makes as anyone, with maybe the exception of the people who booted him out of the band. But in when Dave Mustaine leaves his mortal coil, his contributions to rock music, to heavy rock music, are undisputed. What is it about him, you think, that's not enough for him? What is it about this pain of rejection that endures through the years?
Well, I think that really vividly shows you what it must be like to be driven enough to be a top musician, right? The cost of that that's what it takes to get there, being the sort of person that is probably incapable of getting over something. And everyone's reading about, that amazing quote in the film from Lars Ulrich, is like, it blows my mind that the only thing that stands out to you over the last 20 years is you're firing for Metallica after everything you've achieved since. But yeah, I think it shows what it takes and how driven you have to be, and that there's a real cost to that. You basically, most of us would go, oh, I gave it a shot, I did my best, but he's like, I'll never let that go, because I need to be at the top. But yeah, I mean, it's insane, isn't it? So is it the big four in thrash metal, or the big?
Slayer, Anthrax, Metallica, Megadeth.
Yeah, to re-enter, to become part of the big four with your old band, it's still not to be enough. It's just a real insight into his character. But yeah, I was taken aback by the level of there's something mean, not necessarily in a bad way, about he's got this real kind of, I'm going to fucking take this kind of side to him. And, you need that, I think, if you've got that level of ambition. But yeah, no, I found, I don't think there's anyone in the book that I came away not feeling quite sympathetic for. And again, that image of him waking up on a Monday morning with a crushing drug come down, I think asleep on a floor somewhere with his bandmates looming over him, his bags packed around him and saying, go on the bus, you're fired. It's just kind of, the horror. I mean, you can imagine, can't you?
I have to say that I did a couple. I don't want to say sessions, because we were kids and that's not really what they were like. But I played bass in an early iteration of the Future Heads when I was younger. The band.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Hounds of Love was it? The cover of Hounds of Love was great.
Yeah. I mean, they're old friends. Certainly Ross, the guitarist, is one of my best friends, and I've known those guys forever, and my band used to play with them and stuff. But when they were in a bunch of local bands in Sunderland, and those bands disbanded, and they decided they were going to do this new band, and they were like, oh, come and play bass while we kind of try and work this out. And I remember going around to, I think it was the guitarist Barry's garage, and playing bass on a few songs, and then kind of finding out a couple of weeks later that they were doing it again, but I hadn't been invited. And this isn't anything that's kind of plagued me or hurt in any way, because really I just wasn't good enough. I mean, it was that simple, but it was that thing. I remember obviously being quite primed to be close to them during their ascent when I was at NME. I remember watching them side of stage at Reading, I think it was, on the sort of second to top on the second stage, and being like, if only I'd rehearsed a little bit more when I was a kid, if only I'd got better on my instrument when I was a bit younger. So I can only imagine, really, when, I know how difficult my complicated brain is to let certain things go, painful things. I can only imagine. I didn't judge Dave Mustaine there. It wasn't like, oh, for God's sake, man, grow up. But it was like, God, isn't all this stuff strange? Isn't it strange how pain endures?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there is an active, there's things in my life that I don't think I've got over. And, that's a big question for me. I'd love, I've asked various people over the years, how do you actually just get rid of this thing? And no one's really had a brilliant answer. So, I think the grappling and carrying on, and, I think that's just the nature of it. But there was something you said about when you were listening to Joy Division at work and saying that you felt bad. I think that's a brilliantly vivid illustration, because the potency of music is a double-edged sword, isn't it? And it's when you're in a bad state. I remember having a bad breakup when I was about 24 and listening to the last Elliott Smith album, and it sort of helped me, but in a way I was plunging into the abyss, and kind of, the darkness in the Elliott. Like, if I'm in a stable frame of mind, I can listen to an Elliott Smith record. I love Elliott Smith. I can listen and appreciate neutrally. But if I'm in the wrong state of mind, I almost can't listen to it, because it's like doing a bad drug or something, and kind of plunging into darkness. And that can feel thrilling, but it's a bit dangerous. And it's one of the beautiful things about music that is potent enough to do that. It will really, it can really have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found that working at music magazines. Do you remember them? But
Yeah,
I always remember. Well, there's a few times when I was working in an office, and I remember being like, "This is such a bizarre way to work because you're in this professional environment, but you are constantly all day being like fed mood alterers. You know,
yeah,
like I was sat beneath, and in my NME days, I was literally sat beneath the stereo. And remember this day when Lethal Bizzle came in to play his new record, and he came in, and it was like he turned it up at some ridiculous decibels, and all the marketing people were, like packing up and going for a quick lunch, and we were all just like, we're trying to get this magazine out, and like our ears are bleeding. And then he'd leave, and someone had put like Mazzy Star on, and he'd be like, "Where am I? This is such a sort of
yeah,
emotional roller coaster." And somehow he was supposed to kind of be professional in those environments.
yeah.
I find that it's weird. We just don't think about music like that. We don't think about almost what we're putting into our what we're ingesting via music. I just think
Yeah.
that's so fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's similar at record labels, and obviously music's always playing, and it can be really difficult. But that makes me think of, one of the people I love working with most, who's a sort of hip hop guy, and putting hip hop records on, and then people saying, "Oh, this is a bit shouty," which obviously does have kind of, in a way, has kind of, quite worrying connotations to it, because you basically say, "I don't want to hear an MC," and what is that? And he was very alive to that, and so there used to be this big, "Oh, it's too fucking shouty. Should we put some trip hop on?" Which is basically sort of, sanitized version of this.
Yeah. I loved all the little, I don't want to say sort of snide jabs, but I loved the kind of slight, that just a sort of little threat. There was sort of a little critique of trip hop in there, in certain chapters. I did like that. I do like a lot of. It's funny. My wife, I went through to the other room just before talking to you. My wife's watching that adaptation of that novel. Is it called One Day?
Yes, yeah, yeah. I've heard the adaptation's great, actually.
Yeah, I think the jury's out in her mind at the moment. But I walked through, and obviously it's set in the '90s, and there's a scene that's soundtracked by Portishead, and nothing makes me think of the late '90s more than Portishead.
No.
You just hear that stuff, and it's amazing with trip hop how there's just so many acts within that world that I think are brilliant. But I genuinely think the style of music is just shit, really. Like it is just anemic hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, it had a huge impact on me at the time, but as a, I don't like the phrase gateway drug, but in lieu of a better one, that's sort of what it was for me. At the time, I thought it was hugely exciting, but I was, 14 to 16, whatever. And once you've been really into hip hop, it's hard to see it as anything other than anemic hip hop. And for me, yeah, I mean, there's a snide comment about dubstep in the book, isn't there? I've always quite liked prodding dubstep people because they were just so po-faced and kind of, grime. Wiley would turn up. It was so, it didn't matter what the sound system. Obviously, they wanted to have a good sound system, and Wiley took his mastering incredibly seriously. But there was this admirably punky thing. It was like, turn up, and whatever it's like, we're going to perform and we'll smash it. And if the mic's broken, we'll get another one. And in dubstep, it was all these kind of, very sort of white middle class people saying, well, unless you've been down to Mass and heard it, you can't really judge it. If you can't judge music without going to a sort of rarefied environment in Brixton, then
Yeah. Without getting too timey-wimey, we're having this conversation before we have this talk at Rock and Roll Book Club in Walthamstow on March 7th, but I'm actually going to drop it after Rock and Roll Book Club on March 7th. So I'm confused even by trying to say that. So we should probably wrap up so we have something to talk about on March 7th at Rock and Roll Book Club. And you're flying to the UK, is it tomorrow?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So landing on Monday, and then I've got what shapes. I mean, I never thought that any of this would happen, and it's been codged together. The publisher's done an amazing job, but a family member also set up a couple of things. So it's turned into a kind of, I think it's 4 events in a row, and I never thought that was going to happen. And the downside to that happening when you're 43, like, I think if I was 25, I could take all of that in my stride. But as a slightly more nervous and anxious person, I'm definitely stealing myself for it, but I think it will be. And yeah, talking to you today has just been absolutely brilliant. So I'm hoping it will all feel like this, which will mean
Oh yeah,
I'll,
gonna have a good time. It's good vibes down there, man. I mean, I presume you haven't been there before, just by the fact that it's kind of my local. I live in Leighton, so I'm just down the road from Walthamstow, and it really is one of those things when I go, and I just sort of have to pinch myself. Really, I'm like, oh, the sort of most interesting minds within British music and beyond regularly get together. I mean, I might be overselling it for my involvement, but it's amazing that it's at the bottom of the road. It's just such a brilliant thing that exists. So yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm delighted to be invited. I can't wait to do it. I feel really really grateful to everybody, including you. And yeah, no, I think you're as a man who's just been on TV on Sky talking about the Brits, I think you can include yourself in that.
You just added another thing that sort of timestamps it as well. God, we're in this like strange. What day is it? What time is it? Listen, Jamie, it's been so nice to chat, and I will see you in a couple of days.
Thank you so much for having me. That was great fun. I feel I could talk to you all day, really.
No, amazing. Speak to you soon, man. Safe flight.
Thanks, man.
See you later. Bye.